Hello everyone, Professor Kuzluk here. So I wanted to make a video talking about contentious politics and the role it plays and the role they play in politics today. So when we think about politics, when we take like an introductory to American government course, we often talk about and think about elections and legislatures, courts, even the executive branch and presidents. These formal institutions are certainly central to democratic governance, but they are not the whole story about how and where power emanates in a democracy. Or if we were in a comparative politics class, even in an authoritarian regime, protests still matter. So we know a great deal of political change happens outside of those official channels, driven by people who organize, protest, they might go on strike, as we talked about in class, they might boycott, and they challenge authority directly. Political scientists and sociologists refer to this realm of activity as contentious politics. So understanding contentious politics helps explain how people without formal power can still influence political outcomes. It also helps us understand why major policy changes often emerge during moments of conflict, disruption, and social pressure rather than through routine institutional processes alone. So at its core, contentious politics refers to collective political action that involves conflict, usually between ordinary people and authorities, elites, or dominant institutions. These conflicts arise when groups make claims that challenge existing policies, social hierarchies, or distributions of power. Importantly, contentious politics does not require violence, oftentimes doesn't utilize violence. What makes it contentious is disagreements over legitimacy, authority, or resources. Marches, strikes, sit-ins, boycotts, and acts of civil disobedience all fall under this category of contentious politics. So, do sustained campaigns that pressure governments, corporations, or social institutions to change their behavior. So when we think of contentious politics, we can think about trying to shape corporations' policies, whether it's Target or Walmart or Amazon, or we can think of it as trying to shape governmental policies, trying to shape public policy. So crucially, contentious politics tends to emerge when people believe that normal political channels are insufficient for change. When voting, lobbying, or petitioning fail to produce change, or when certain groups are excluded from those channels altogether, collective action becomes a way to force issues onto the political agenda. This leads us to social movements and protest movements. A social movement, which some of our readings will talk about, and we'll read about social movements and protest movements and the differences, but for our purpose, jumping out at the start here, a social movement is a sustained movement, organized effort. It's a sustained, organized effort by a group of people to bring about or resist social or political change. Social movements are not isolated one-off events. They involve shared goals, collective identities, leadership structures, and strategies that unfold over time. A sustained movement. A protest movement, by contrast, can refer and often refers to more narrowly focused events, narrowly to to maybe a one-off or just a couple events. So these might be marches, like a march that occurs, a demonstration, maybe a sit-in or a strike. These protests, instead of sustained movements, these protests are tools that movements use, but a movement is broader than any single protest. A movement can exist even when it is not constantly mobilizing people in the streets. So social movements vary widely in their goals. Some seek concrete policy changes, such as changes in labor law or environmental regulation. Others aim for deeper transformation in social norms, identity, maybe in power relations. Some movements push for expansion of rights, while others seek to defend existing arrangements or reverse social changes. So what unites them is that they operate outside formal institutions while still attempting to influence what those institutions do. In democratic systems, like in the US, contentious politics plays an especially important role. At first glance, this might seem to be a bit of a paradox. If democracies and democratic societies provide elections, representation, and civil liberties, why would protests and social movements be necessary at all? The answer is that democracies are unequal and imperfect systems. Political influence is oftentimes unevenly distributed. Wealthy interests, organized groups, interest groups, and political elites tend to have greater access to decision makers. Elections occur infrequently, and many issues never reach the ballot box at all. Contentious politics helps address these gaps. Social movements expand political participation by mobilizing people who might otherwise be disengaged from formal politics, especially young people, marginalized communities, and those without access to institutional power to construct changes. They also shape public debate by reframing problems and introducing new issues into political discourse. To see how this happens, and this will be an example that videos down the road will touch on and we'll talk about in class, but to see how this works, consider the civil rights movement in the United States. For decades, racial segregation and discrimination were embedded in law and practice, particularly in the South in the US. Formal political institutions either upheld these systems or failed to challenge them. Through sustained collective action, through boycotts, marches, sit-ins, and civil disobedience, the civil rights movement forced racial injustices onto the national agenda. Importantly, these actions did not immediately change policy on their own. Instead, they altered public opinion, created political pressure, and made inaction costly for elected officials. Major legislative achievements like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were the result of these sustained pressure movements combined with institutionalized allies in Congress and the executive branch. The movement shows how contentious politics can act as a catalyst, opening political space that institutions alone were unable or unwilling to create. Another critical function of contentious politics in democracies is signaling intensity. Voting tells policymakers what people prefer. Protest tells them how strongly they feel. Large, sustained, or disruptive movements communicate that an issue carries political costs if ignored. This logic is visible in more recent movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement. While public opinion on policing and racial justice was already divided, mass protests following high-profile incidents of perceived police brutality dramatically increased the salience of these issues. Even where policy change was uneven or maybe contested, the movement succeeded in reshaping public discourse, altering media coverage, influencing local policy debates, and pushing elected officials to take positions they might otherwise have avoided taking. This illustrates a key point for contentious politics. Movements do not need immediate legislative victories to exert political influence. So when we ask ourselves the question of are protests and social movements successful, that's where we start to see that that's a tricky answer. What do we mean by success? When we ask, do protest movements and social movements work? It depends a lot on what we mean by work. So contentious politics also interacts with democratic institutions in more indirect ways. Movements can divide political elites, empowering reformist factions within parties or within bureaucracies. They can pressure parties to adopt new platforms, recruit movement activists as candidates, or adjust policy priorities to maintain electoral coalitions. These are all things that when we think, well, is that protest or social movement working? We might not see on the surface. We might see that protest on the street and think that's all that happened. But how it shapes and evolves institutions takes a deeper look at that protest movement to understand, is it actually shaping the power structure in a democracy? So the labor movement provides a classic example, one again we'll read more and deeper into. Organized labor has used strikes, mass mobilization, and workplace disruption to pressure both employers and the state. Over time, these actions contributed to labor protections, collective bargaining rights, and social welfare policies. What's important here is that the labor movement rarely succeeded through protests alone. They combine contentious actions and contentious politics with institutional strategies, unionization, party alliances, litigation, and electoral engagement. Protests opened the door, institutional politics translated pressure into policy, or at least policy change, the moving of policies. This pattern highlights a broader insight. Successful social movements typically operate across multiple arenas. They combine street-level mobilization with legal challenges, media campaigns, and oftentimes the utilization of lobbying and through institutional means. So movements that rely exclusively on protests oftentimes struggle to achieve durable policy change. So contentious politics, however, is not always celebrated in democracies. Protests can, as we know, disrupt daily life, polarize societies, and challenge authority in uncomfortable ways. Critics of contentious politics often argue that movements bypass democratic procedures, democratic processes, represent only vocal minorities, or undermine social stability. This tension is inherent to democratic politics, though. Democracies depend on both institutional participation and extra institutional pressure. Too little protest can signal apathy or exclusion. Too much can signal maybe institutional failure or even maybe societal breakdown. So the key question then is, how do social movements and protest movements actually shape public policy? That answer is rarely direct or immediate. Instead, movements influence policy through, we can say, through several mechanisms. First, they shape political agendas by sustaining attention or drawing attention to an issue, framing issues in moral or urgent terms. Movements force policymakers to respond, even if only rhetorically at first. Second, movements influence public opinion. Media coverage of protests combined with personal experience and social networks can shape how people understand problems and understand how to find solutions to those problems. These shifts matter because politicians can respond to and do respond to electoral incentives. Third, movements can create or exploit political opportunities. Crises, elections, leadership changes, or policy failures can open windows in which movements demand to become more achievable, or the demands that those that are engaging in contentious politics can now become more achievable. This political opportunity structure we'll learn more about or read more about. I'll make a couple videos about these different theories. Political opportunity structures, absolutely one of the main hallmarks of contemporary social movement literature. Movements can oftentimes work through institutional allies. Courts, legislatures, and bureaucracies can serve as channels for translating movement pressure into policy, especially when movements align with sympathetic officials. And finally, movements shape public policy over the long term by changing norms and expectations. Even when immediate demands fail or they seem to be failing, movements can redefine what is considered legitimate or even what is possible in politics. Environmental movements provide a useful illustration here. Early environmental activism did not immediately halt pollution or create an immediate end to environmental degradation. But it transformed how societies think about environmental harm, regulation, and who holds responsibility. Over time, these shifts contributed to regulatory framework structures that are changing, international agreements to combat environmental concerns, and new political priorities, even as conflicts continue about these issues. So, when we think about contentious politics and think about are movements successful, how do people bring about change? How do people utilize power? It's not always simple to see if a movement's being successful. So that's why studying contentious politics, social movements, protests is an interesting and worthwhile phenomenon. Thank you.